Welcome, friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, and weird history. Happy spooky season, you little ghoul, you. Thank you for joining me today. Happy October. I am so excited about our episode today, and to get us started, I have just one question for you. What does silver, opium, and sheep poo-poo have in common? I'll give you a moment. Think about it. Let it ruminate, marinate in your brain. Give you a moment. Think it over. 3, 2, 1, together. Tea. Yes, that is right, dear one. Tea. Hot leaf juice. Go-go water for people who are coffee averse. But how in the sweet Sobek did such a cottagecore Nana vibe drink get mixed up with opium dens, murder, and prostitution? Well, that is precisely what we are going to talk about today, my delicious little donut. But first, we must take care of some housekeeping. First of all, thank you so much for your patience with the pushback of this episode. I was in the States with my family and had less time than I anticipated for podcasty things, and my guests were generous enough to allow me to push their episodes first and do this one later. Thank you to our wonderful guests who allowed me to do that, and thank you to you for being patient while I spent time with my family. Second thing, okay? If you have not left a rating or review yet, we are so close to our goal of 200 ratings and / reviews by the end of the year. Remember, season 9 is over at the end of October. We'll be done, skis, okay? And it would be really cool if we could get to 200 ratings and reviews by the end of this season. I appreciate it so very much. Next order of business, if you have not joined us over on YouTube, you definitely should. It's a great place to be. It is a wonderful free 99 way to support the podcast. There will be some new videos coming out that are not just the video versions of the podcast. I've been working with my unpaid intern on some travel vlogs, on some taste testing through history things, and we also do history that ate over here, which is really fun because we cook together and we do some fun historical cooking thingies. Our final order of business is, if you have not heard about the For the Love of History app that we are currently raising money for, I'm here to tell you about it right now. We are raising money for an app that would accompany For the Love of History podcast, and after each episode there would be some review questions, we'd have some quiz games, there would be hydration checkups, there would be scavenger hunts, history walks, all sorts of fun things that we have planned for this For the Love of History app. So if you would like to donate to that and become a beta tester whenever that comes out, you can take a look at that in the show notes and support if you can. If not, totally fine. Thank you for being here. And with that, I do believe housekeeping is over, and it is time for us to dive into the dark history of tea. So grab a beverage, preferably one with no toxic substances in it, and let's get to it. Few things in the world have changed history as much as tea. It's in nearly every kitchen in the world, and it's the drink of choice for billions of people from the US to Japan, India, South Africa, and of course, England. It's shaped the landscape of history by warming hearts, cheering up bad days, bringing friends and family together, and has systematically ruined the lives of countless people over hundreds of years. When you are pouring your boiling water from your kettle over your Earl Grey or English breakfast, I'm sure unimaginable suffering, prostitution, and opium are not the first things that pop into your mind. But unfortunately, they will be after this episode, because just like spices, I'm about to ruin tea for you, dear one. But before we dive into that, let's talk about where in the heck tea comes from, and how it has become synonymous with England. Nowadays, tea can be found all over the world, and many different varieties of tea can grow in different countries. But originally, tea came from China. And the earliest written evidence we have of tea comes from the Tang Dynasty in the book The Classic of Tea, written between 760 and 720 CE. The earliest archaeological remains of tea that we have come from 500 years before in the tomb of a Han Dynasty emperor. For thousands of years, tea was used as ritual offerings, medicine, food, and just a fun little drink to keep you awake while you studied for the Buddhist bureaucracy test. Say that 10 times fast. I did. I said that 4 different times before I got Buddhist bureaucracy right. Anyways, for centuries, China and tea were just chilling, having a great time. And of course, it was traded over the Silk Road, and it made its way to Korea and Japan, and everyone was consuming a respectable amount of tea and respecting China's authority over said tea. Until colonization. Yup. Colonization came and ruined everything. In 1559, Giovanni Battista Ramusio wrote about chai katai, which means China tea, in his series Voyages and Travels. This is the first mention of tea in European literature. It was initially classified as a drug, and that's not true because tea often does contain caffeine, and it was used for medical purposes like a drug. Initially, demand for this leaf water was extremely low. England was all about that jitter juice, that Java, that cup of joe. The East India Trading Company didn't make its first purchase of tea until 1664, and it was a measly 100 pounds, going straight to the crustiest of the upper crust, where it found its way to the royal palace and the chambers of Queen Catherine of Braganza. Now, Cathy Cat was a very devout lady, and she did not like the fact that the British royals were pretty much plastered from dawn till dusk, and if they weren't drunk, they were drinking their way to an anxiety attack with oodles and oodles of coffee. Cathy Cat decided that she was going to change things and created a very demure, a very mindful tradition of tea time. Both tea and the china it was poured into was an incredible display of wealth, manners, and demureness. And just like celebrities of today set trends, so too did the royals. This tea phenomenon trickled down to the gentry and soon found its way into established coffee houses where men of knowledge would go to discuss the important topics of the day. Honestly, English coffee houses could be a topic all on their own. They are very interesting, but for our purposes today, just know that coffee drinkers quickly began changing their beverage of choice from coffee to tea, and that was very much by design. Firstly, Charles II, Cathy Cat's husband, didn't like coffee houses because he thought that they were dangerous places for creating dissent and political trouble. So he was all about shutting down these coffee houses in favor of cute little tea houses. Secondly, tea was easier to store and didn't go bad as quickly as coffee did. And thirdly, the East India Company saw the potential to make exponentially more money on tea than they did coffee and other things. And if the East India Company made more money, the English government made more money because the lines of business and government were basically non-existent at this time. The only problem with this plan is the fact that China saw England as a barbaric nation of lawless scoundrels and wanted nothing to do with the low-quality products England was peddling in an attempt to trade for tea. The emperor himself at the time said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no products within its borders. There is, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." And I just have one question for the East India Company. Do you need some aloe for that burn? Because China gotcha. China got you, my friend. How does it feel to be called a barbarian by the very people who you call a barbarian? Anyways, I digress. In other words, we don't want your janky shaisa. All we want is silver. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Silver was the only thing that China would exchange for tea. And exchanging silver for a consumable good like tea is not a very sound economic plan. Money begets money, but tea only begets PP, which is not a great trade. But there was nothing England could do. It was being bled dry, and there was no financial gain for them to import tea into the country, but it was already too late. Popularity was growing, but the price and the taxes were prohibitive. So the big-brained boys at the East India Trading Company put their little noggins together and brainstormed ideas about what they could do to get this tea out of China. And do you know what they decided to do? Become the world's largest drug cartel. What? I know. The real East India Trading Company is a far cry from what we've seen in the Pirates of the Caribbean. Describing the EIC as just a big shipping business is like describing Pablo Escobar as just a politician. The East India Company was basically the mafia for England. They had standing armies and they were beholden to no laws, essentially. They could do whatever terrible things they saw fit in order to make money. To kind of get an idea of what the East India Company was like, I'd like you to imagine if Apple had its own standing army, and if they found out that some state or some country or some group of people were using Windows products, they would be legally able to go into that area and force whoever was using that Chromebook to not only stop using them and start using Apple products instead, but also force those people into slave labor, kill a few people who dared not to use a MacBook, and commit all sorts of atrocities in the name of capitalism. All the good words today. Colonialism, capitalism, having a great time. We're having a great time. We're loving this. Well, we're having a great time. Such a good time. And in true evil genius fashion, the East India Company decided to use all of its resources to create something called the Opium Triangle. You're in a dark room. A sickly, sweet smell fills the air. Bodies lie in unnatural positions across wooden benches. Girls, much too young to be in a place like this, bring fresh pipes to the vacant-eyed patrons. As you venture deeper into the shop, the bodies around you become more and more corpse-like. A teenage pipe girl trips over the body of a man long gone cold, and she slowly walks to the front to inform the owner that another one has died. The body is taken to the back and unceremoniously dropped on the floor to make room for the next lost soul that finds its way to the opium den. The impact of opium on China's population cannot be overstated. The EIC systematically pumped China full of opium. And I am not exaggerating when I say that they really were a drug cartel. In order to make money off of the tea trade with China, the EIC went full capitalism and used their colonies in India to produce opium. Then they would take that opium to China, where they would sell it illegally to corrupt officials and drug dealers who would give them Chinese silver, and then the East India Company would go to a different port in China and use that silver to buy tea. Then this tea would go back to England where it was sold, and then some of that money would go to the Indian colonies, where they would be used to produce opium, and the whole thing just was a continuous cycle over and over again, thus creating the opium triangle with tea, silver, and opium. And this little drug cartel turned out to be incredibly profitable for England. In just 60 short years, the EIC went from importing simply 100 pounds of tea in 1664 to nearly 1 million pounds per year by the end of the 1720s, and 3,700,000 pounds of tea by the 1750s. I'm gonna need a math person to math that out, because what? That seems like a lot. And 3 million pounds of tea meant a lot of opium. Opium was not new to China. In fact, it had been used as medicine for quite some time. But the sheer amount of opium that was coming into the country made it cheaper and more accessible. In addition, in the 17th century, Europeans brought over the idea of smoking opium with tobacco, so the casual smoker would quickly become addicted. Opium is one of the most addictive narcotics in the world, and even when China made laws banning the substance, it was too late because the claws of opium were firmly dug into the population. One thing that I really want to highlight, dear one, is that when researching the effects of opium on China, what you find most is the effects of opium on the economy, which makes sense because, East India Trading Company, economy, I get it. But article after article, documentary after documentary really only focuses on the economic impact of opium, which is all well and good, okay? It's important to know and learn, but I find that there's a distinct lack of humanity when it comes to talking about the opium wars. What we don't hear about is the fact that as many as 40 million people, or 10% of China's population, was addicted to opium by the end of the 19th century. China's life expectancy dropped, people weren't going to school, young girls were being sold into prostitution to pay for the debts that their families got into because of opium addiction. When you use opium first, you can just use a small amount, but in order to have the same effects over time, you need to increase the amount of opium that you use, and that increase got real expensive real fast. And if you have ever been in active addiction or around someone who is in active addiction or seen any sort of media about addiction, you know that it is nearly impossible to stop, especially when there is a giant corporation just pushing it into the country. China was up a creek with no paddle. And the Emperor Lin and various government officials tried their darndest to mitigate the effects of opium. They made laws, they prosecuted drug dealers, they prosecuted drug users, they did all of this stuff, and in 1839, Emperor Lin had had enough. He threw up his hands and he started to raid a bunch of opium dens and ports. He created all sorts of blockades, and he even put some British merchants under house arrest and confiscated 1,000 tons of opium, okay? Let's just conceptualize what 1,000 tons is for a second, because to me, that's just a number, okay? But 1,000 tons? 1 ton is about the size of a small car. An African elephant is about 8 tons. So whatever 1,000 divided by 8 is, that's how many elephants. Hold on, I'll be right back with that number. 125. 125 elephants worth of opium. What? And just to give you even more perspective on how much opium this is, you need only a little bit, maybe a few grams of opium to put in a pipe and smoke. That's so much. That is so much. And I'm sure Emperor Lin's flabbers were just as gasted as mine because he wrote Queen Victoria a letter in 1839 saying, "Your Majesty has not before officially notified, and you may plead ignorance on the severity of our laws, but I now give you assurance that we mean to cut this harmful drug forever." But this letter never made it to Queen Victoria. This letter, written by the Emperor of China, was stopped by Charles Elliot, who was simply the chief superintendent of British trade in China. And do you know why he blocked this letter? It's gonna make you mad, okay? He said this letter from the Emperor of China was not on equal diplomatic terms and therefore was not appropriate to be received by the Queen of England. Charles? What? Hold on. So Emperor and Queen, it's not China, one of the largest empires of the time? Like, Charles, what are we talking about here? What are we doing here, Charles? This is how you get yourself on the list of castor oil recipients. Just as soon as time travel is invented, sir, it's Poop City for you, okay? Poop City for you, Charles. But I digress. Shortly after this, the First Opium War was declared by Britain, and yet again, more havoc, more death, and more destruction came to the shores of China, all because of some hot green leaf water. 1 year later, Emperor Lin wrote again to Queen Victoria saying, quote, "Where is your conscience? I've heard that the smoke of opium is very strictly forbidden by your country, since it's not permitted to do harm to your own country. Then even less should it be passed on to the harm of other countries." But unfortunately, what Emperor Lin did not know is that this letter would not reach Queen Victoria, and opium was very much legal and used in England. So his pleas fell on deaf ears. During the First Opium War, British soldiers slaughtered Chinese military and civilians. In the writings of many British officers and soldiers fighting in the First Opium War, there was a sense of shame and disgust about what they were doing in China. In Sarah Charrington Holland's book, The Dark History of Tea, he writes, quote, "One officer confessed, 'Many most barbarous things occurred, disgraceful to our men,' while another soldier described his revulsion at a sea blackened with floating corpses." China was devastated. The First Opium War ended in 1842, and England began telling China all the things that they wanted because they won, which started off with granting more treaty ports where they could trade. They were also given Hong Kong Island, and they forced China to pay them back for the war. Not only were they pushing opium into the country and creating this made-up war for capitalism, they also said that you're gonna pay for it. You're gonna pay for it, China. This might be the first time I give a whole ass country a garbage human label. Looking back, there's definitely some other countries that need to have the garbage human label, so I reserve the right to retroactively assign that label. And I've got a few countries in mind. I'm looking at you, Netherlands, okay? And I will never forget what you did for nutmeg, all right? But I digress. England continued to push opium into the country, taking out silver and tea, and once again in 1856, the Second Opium War started. China lost and was forced to legalize opium. It would take decades for China to recover, and the island of Hong Kong didn't go back to China until 1997. For hundreds of years, England bled the country dry, forcing an opium epidemic, all for that sweet, sweet leaf juice that was ironically wreaking absolute havoc back on British shores. To drink tea was to court death. For your average Victorian laborer, your morning cuppa was a gamble with your health. Would you go blind? Would you develop stomach ulcers? Would your esophagus be cut to shreds? Would you just straight up die? Surely this is an exaggeration, TK. Surely this health drink, this leaf water that has been used for centuries, could not do anything more than invigorate the senses and prepare these poor souls for the hellish work conditions that they were about to enter. Right? Right? Well, I hate to break it to you, my delicious little donut, but since the very beginning, tea has been tampered with in ways that made it dangerous to drink. In the first half of the 18th century, 3 million pounds of tea were smuggled into the country, which was 3 times more than the tea that was coming in via legal channels. Tea smugglers were just as organized as the legal businesses, with mules that were often women who shoved as much as 18 pounds or 8 kilograms of tea in their specially made petticoats or hats or waistcoats that were specifically modified for smuggling. And these illegal businesses also had whole ass fitted ships for the job. They had specially made ships for tea smuggling. And these smugglers even had insurance to insure these ships, to insure these smuggling trips. And guess who they were insured by? None other than the Lloyd's of London, which is an insurance company that is still around to this day. It is arguably one of the largest insurance companies, and I think maybe one of the oldest. I'm not sure about that, don't quote me, but it is, the Lloyd's of London is like, it's like the insurance company, okay? And they were insuring smugglers. What? What is this? What is history sometimes? These smugglers were smart. These smugglers were prepared, and they were ruthless. Many a customs officer lost their life trying to stop these mafia-level tea smugglers. The tea these smugglers brought in was untaxed and unregulated, meaning there was no one checking up on the quality of these products, so they could do whatever they wanted to make more money, which meant they were stretching out their supply by adding all kinds of banana sandwich shiznit to the tea, because the more tea you had, the more money you made. They were not worried about the quality of the tea because this was illegal tea. These additives could be things like leaves from other plants like hawthorn, which on the surface seems like absolutely no problem. Not a big D. Not a big D. Not a big deal, because people drink hawthorn berry tea all the time. But the problem with hawthorn berry tea is that it is a reddish pink color, and the tea that people were used to drinking from China was either green or dark brown. So these smugglers added delicious things like iron filings or verdigris, which is that green stuff that comes when copper oxidizes. They also added phosphorus sulfate, which could cause iron poisoning. They also added copper carbonate and sheep poop. They added sheep poop, sheep caca, sheep forbidden fudge. They added it to the tea. But wait, but just you wait, okay? What my first thought was, what happens if you didn't have a sheep nearby? What if a sheep was in short supply? Don't worry. Don't you worry about that, dear one, because you could just use chamber lye. And I encourage you to put down any food that you are eating just now, just for a sec, okay? While I explain to you what chamber lye is, okay? All right, are we good? Sandwich down, coffee down, snack down. Well, a chamber pot is a little pot where you evacuate your bowels, okay, in your room, all right? And then when your homemade lemonade and fudge sits in there and ferments for a while, okay, that's what chamber lye is. Chamber lye is a nice way to say fermented pipé, okay? So they would add that. They would add that to the tea for coloring and flavor. Ugh. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that we both know that information now. I wish we could bleach our brains, but we can't. And if I have to know this, you have to know this. But let's just move on. I need to take a second. Okay. All right. So we've got toxic ass tea leaves, okay? But the leaves which you made your tea with were not the only things that could kill you or do irreparable damage to the inside of your meat sack. Nay, nay, dear one, the milk and sugar you heap into your morning poop tea also contained horrible things like shards of glass in sugar to make it more sparkly, and watered down milk with chalk added for that extra good whiteness, because as we all know, the shinier your sugar is and the whiter your milk is, the better it is for you. I'm not exaggerating. There were so many adulterated products on the market that people began to mistrust if milk looked too pale or sugar didn't shine like diamonds. The doctored products looked more wholesome to the consumer. And this has absolutely nothing to do with tea, but I just have to tell you this because it was in the book, The Dark History of Tea, that I was reading. So, according to the London County Medical Officer in the late 1800s, a test of luxury milk products like ice cream revealed that cotton, fibers, lice, bed bugs, bug legs, fleas, straw, human hair, and both cat and dog hair were in ice cream. We can't go one freaking episode without the Victorians doing something absolutely out of pocket. What would be the reason? Tell me the reason why bugs' legs, fleas, straw, and human hair would be. What purpose did that serve? Why? I have so many questions that I don't really know if I want the answers to, but I digress. It wasn't only the manufacturers of these products who were doing all sorts of banana sandwich things. People were also purposefully adulterating their milk at home. Having fresh milk on the daily was an absolute luxury during this time and was not at all accessible to the everyday person. So, what people would do to purify milk, and I just have to say this as a disclaimer, do not do this, okay? Do not do what I'm about to say. In order to purify the milk and remove the sour taste and smell from the spoiled milk, people would add boric freaking acid to their milk. And I don't know if we are on the same parts of the internet, if we venture onto the same black holes. A few months ago, there was a trend where people were drinking borax. For why? I don't know, but history is repeating itself because essentially borax and boric acid are the same chemical compound. They're very similar. So I did not have that on my bingo card of things that repeat in history, but here we are, people consuming borax and boric acid. So between the glass in the sugar, all of the various things in the milk, and the literal poopy caca in the tea, having a cup of tea in the morning was an absolute hazard to your health. At one point, tea was considered more of a health risk than opium. But thankfully, in the 1860s, the Food Adulteration Act was created, and by 1880, most of the food that was being tested back then was sans poo-poo caca, iron filings, and bug legs. Despite the death and the crime that permeated every single facet of tea, from the cultivation to the procurement to the brewing of it, the popularity of this slightly bitter leaf water eclipsed coffee, chocolate, and alcohol. Eventually, the East India Company ended, and the cultivation of tea spread around the world, making China less important in this tea, opium, silver triangle and eventually obsolete. But the trend of drinking tea never faded in England, even during both world wars, and in fact, the love of tea was strengthened in these two instances, which, I mean, the history of tea and England past this time period is very deep, very long, very weird. And today, the British drink approximately 1 million cups of tea on the daily, but they're not even number one when it comes to tea consumption. And in fact, they're just number 6, and they are beat out for first place by Turkey, second place Morocco, and third place Ireland. And I know there's an Irish delicious donut out there somewhere going, yes! Not all tea history is steeped in death and murder and sheep poo-poo, but a good majority of it is. And while I don't mean to be out here raining on your parade while you curl up with a cup of warm English breakfast, I do think it's important to keep this deadly, dark, and violent history in mind and remember that history is all around us. Everything in your home has a history. Everything you eat, everything you look at has a history, and it's all very much connected. And in addition to keeping this very bleak thing in mind, a slightly happier note to end on. When you are pouring your morning cuppa, I would like to invite you to say a little thank you to those heroes who don't wear capes. Food quality inspectors and regulators, for making sure that we don't have glass and sheep poop in our morning brew. Well, dear one, we have come to our final thought, and all I have to say is there's not a lot that's more scary than colonialism. So to kind of brighten up the end of our episode, let's talk about the term spill the tea. While I was doing my research, I found the origins of spill the tea, which is a slang term that is often associated with Gen Z. But a lot of the Gen Z slang that we now consider Gen Z actually comes from Black and Latino LGBTQ ballroom culture. And many of the terms that are commonplace now, like kiki, slay, serve, work, and spill the tea, come from the ballroom scene. And like most words, tea has had its own etymological journey. It first appears in writing in the 1994 book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, written by John Berendt, Berendt. In his book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, there is a character named Lady Chablis, and she is a transgender woman, and she is quoted to say, "When black boys find out my tea, honey, they be ready to kick my ass." And she is talking about her tea, her truth, the fact that she is transgender. So the word tea, just spelled out letter T, has developed and changed, and now we associate it with spilling the beans, talking about the hot gossip, things like that. And I just thought that that was really cool and you would like to know about it. And now we both know a little bit more about the phrase spill the tea, which is, I think, very cool, and I hope you enjoyed that. Well, dear one, thank you so much for joining me today. That is the end of the episode. That is all she wrote. I'm so happy to be back home. I'm happy to be back in the history headquarters. I'm happy to be back recording episodes. And I'm so excited for spooky season. I hope you are too, because we got some really cool topics ahead of us. So to close out our episode today, I just want to thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the podcast. If you would like to support the podcast in more ways than listening to the episodes and watching them on YouTube, you can join us over on Patreon. We've got lots of fun things. You get early access to the episode. You get bonus content like me reading this 1879, 1879? What? 1879 Egyptian history book written by Sir Arthur Wilkinson. So I'll be reading this over on Patreon, so you can listen to that. There are updates all the time. We have a book club over there. There's lots of fun things, so you can join us over on Patreon for less than a cup of coffee. And it's a really great way to support the podcast. And if that's not a thing for you right now, that's totally okay. You can also leave a rating or review. You can share this or any episode with your friend. That is such a great way to support the podcast. And yeah, that's all. That's all I got for you. Make sure that you go do something nice for yourself. Make sure that you go outside, touch some grass, drink your water, which I'm about to do right now. And with that, I will see you next week when we talk about some pirate ladies. Pirates, quintessential spooky season stuff. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. I'll see you there, okay? I love you so much. Talk to you later. Bye! Yeah, it's been a really long time since we've done this. Ted! If you want my future, forget my past. I've got nothing. Oh wait, I opened this to drink it. Oh, hydration. Okay. That was gross. Which one is just the one for me? Just one person. This one. The one that looks like a little butt. That looks good to me, Batman. I've never used it. Until today. Yes. Okay, oh, I feel lovely. I feel quite lovely. In fact, I really like this dress. How do you feel about it? I like these earrings, too. I think we're looking fit for a tea party. Even though you won't want to go to a tea party after you listen to it. I apologize in advance for everything that is about to be happening in this episode. There's a lot. There's a lot going on in this episode. Does this look all right? I promise I will not do... No, I can't make that promise that I won't do any terrible British accents. I can't promise that to you. Okay, let's do it. All right, to then. It's already begun.